American Politics Today, Chapter 8, Part 2, Campaign Finance. Campaign finance refers to money collected for and spent on campaigns and elections by candidates, political parties, and other organizations and individuals. The Federal Election Commission is in charge of administering election laws, including the complex regulations pertaining to how campaigns can spend money. Changes in campaign finance rules, which were passed as the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act, the BCRA, took effect after the 2002 elections and have been modified by subsequent Supreme Court decisions, most notably Citizens United versus Federal Election Commission in 2010 and McCutcheon versus Federal Election Commission in 2014, which we describe later. While campaign finance law is complex, most Americans believe the effects of campaign finance are simple. Candidates cannot win without spending money. Victory goes to candidate with the larger budget, and as a result, candidates listen to large donors and ignore average citizens. They also believe that elections cost too much. The reality is much more complex. Candidates need money to run effective campaigns, particularly to pay for campaign ads. But spending does not guarantee victory. And while candidates court large donors, they are even more obsessed with winning the support of ordinary citizens. Because in the end, elections are about votes, not money. Types of contributions and funding organizations. The limits on campaign contributions in the BCRA, also known as the McCain-Feingold Act, vary depending on whether contributions are made by an individual or a group and by the type of group. As Table 8.1 shows, these limits were modified in April 2014 by a 5-4 ruling in McCutcheon versus the Federal Election Commission, in which the Supreme Court struck down limits on overall campaign contributions to candidates and PACs. I will go ahead and zoom in on this so that you can read this. See the graph, should you need to pause this. A second Supreme Court, Citizens United versus Federal Election Commission, also eliminated restrictions on campaign advertising by corporations, organizations, and labor unions within 30 days of a primary or 60 days of a general election, which led to large increases in spending by these groups. Current law distinguishes between independent expenditures, in which a party or group spends money to advocate for a candidate, but the candidate or the campaign does not control, direct, or approve the activity, and coordinated expenditures in which the candidate has some control. Independent expenditures are not limited, but coordinated expenditures are. For example, in Senate races, there is a cap on coordinated expenditures by political parties ranging from several $100,000 in small states like Delaware to several $1 million in California. A second distinction in campaign finance laws is between hard money, meaning contributions to a candidate, party, organization, or other group that are intended to help elect or defeat a specific candidate, and soft money, meaning funds that are used for other activities and are not subject to the limits imposed on hard money. Groups defined by IRS regulations as 527 organizations, for example, can raise unlimited soft money from individuals or corporations for voter mobilization and for issue advocacy, but these expenditures must not be coordinated with a candidate or a party. Ads by 527s cannot advocate the election or defeat of a particular candidate or political party. Another type of organization, again described using the IRS code, is the 501c4, which often collects and spends soft money. The principal difference between the 527s and the 501c4 is that the latter type of organization does not have to disclose the names of its contributors. A third type of organization, the Political Action Committee, PAC, is a group that aims to elect or defeat particular candidates or a particular political party. A company or organization can form a PAC and solicit contributions from employees or group members. As Table 8.1 shows, the amount of PACs can give to each candidate in an election is limited, but these limits pertain only to hard money. PACs can also form 527s, which can then accept unlimited amounts of soft money. So-called super PACs are PACs that do not donate to candidates but use soft money to make unlimited independent expenditures in campaigns. As discussed in Chapter 7, political party committees are entities within the Republican and Democratic parties. Both major parties have a national committee and a campaign committee in each house of Congress. Party committees are limited in the amount of hard money they can give to any candidate's campaign and in the amount they can spend on behalf of the candidates as a coordinated expenditure. However, a party committee and after citizens, united organizations, corporations, and labor unions can spend an unlimited amount in independent expenditures to elect a candidate or candidates. Current law gives presidential candidates the ability to receive federal campaign funds for the primary and general election campaign. In the primary, these are matching funds. In the general election, they are a block grant. These federal funds are generated in part by money that taxpayers voluntarily allocate out of their federal taxes by checking off a box on their tax return form. However, in order to accept federal funds, presidential candidates must abide by overall spending limits, and during the nomination process, by state spending caps. During the last two presidential campaigns, all the major candidates decided against accepting these funds during the nomination and general election campaign, which meant they were not bound by the spending cap. Although individual contributors were still limited to the amounts shown in Table 8.1, the complex campaign finance regulations reflect two simple truths. First, any limits on campaign activities involved balancing the right to free speech about candidates and issues with the idea that rich people or well-funded organizations should not be allowed to dominate to what voters hear during the campaign. Second, an enormous amount of money is spent on American elections. See Table 8.2. I'm going to zone in a little bit so that you can see this. There you go. There. The effects of money in politics. The raw data on campaign finance do not always tell the whole story. For example, while total spending is often quite high, it is important to remember that a large percentage of campaign expenditures are for advertising. A 30-second ad on a major network can cost tens of hundreds of thousands of dollars. Given that even House campaigns may run hundreds of ads and presidential campaigns runs tens of thousands, it is easy to see why a campaign costs pile up so quickly. The principal concern about all this campaign cash is that the amount of money spent on a candidate's campaign might matter more than the candidate's qualifications or issue positions. That is, candidates in particular, wealthy ones who can self-fund their campaigns, who get elected regardless of how good a job they would do, simply because they have more money than competing candidates to pay for ads. Polls, a large staff, and mobilization efforts. Another concern is that individuals and organizations or corporations that can afford to make large contributions or fund their own electioneering efforts might be able to dictate election outcomes, or by funding certain candidates' campaigns, garner disproportionate influence over subsequent behavior of elected officials. See the Take a Stand feature. However, there is little evidence that campaign contributions alter legislators' behavior, or that contributors rewarded with votes supporting their causes, favorable policies. On the other hand, contributions may help with access getting, and I'm going to kind of pause this in case you want to read that. The donor to appointment to present arguments to a politician or his or her staff. But people and organizations who contribute are already friendly with the politicians they support, so the politicians would likely hear their arguments in any case. It's also clear that having a lot of campaign cash doesn't make a candidate into a winner, and that winners don't always outspend their opponents. The poster children for this argument are billionaires, Tom Steyer and Mike Bloomberg, who both ran for the Democratic presidential nomination in 2020. Both candidates spent millions on their campaigns, running thousands of ads, opening field offices, and hiring large staffs. Even so, both failed to attract much support. And in the 2016 general election, Hillary Clinton's campaign outspent Trump's by nearly $200 million. The Democratic Party and allied outside groups also outspent the Republican Party and its groups by a similar amount. Even so, Trump won. Of course, Trump entered the campaign with high levels of name recognition, and his campaign message resonated with Republican primary voters. But that is exactly the point. Victories aren't bought with campaign cash. Candidates need a base level of funding to hire staff, travel, and run some campaign ads. Beyond that point, success is a function of what candidates say and do, not the dollar amount of contributions they receive or the number of ads run on their behalf. How do the voters decide? All the electoral activities we have considered so far are directed at citizens making sure they are registered to vote, influencing their voting decisions, and getting them to the polls. Now we examine how citizens respond to these influences. The first things to understand are that only a minority of citizens report high levels of interest in campaigns. Many people know little about the candidates or the issues, and many people do not vote. Who votes and why? Politics is everywhere, but getting involved is your choice. Voting and other forms of political participation are optional. Even a strong preference between two candidates may not drive citizens to the polls. They may not be motivated to vote because each person's vote is just one of many. And it's true that the only time a vote counts, in the sense that it changes the outcome, is when the other votes are split evenly so that one vote breaks the tie. Moreover, voting involves costs. Even if citizens don't learn about the candidates but want to vote anyway, they still have to get to the polls on election day. Thus, the paradox of voting is this: why does anyone vote given that voting is costly and the chances of affecting the outcome are small? Figure 8.2. Let me kind of zoom in on that so you can kind of see the graph. And that's the turnout for the midterms. Figure 8.2 shows that among Americans, the percentage of registered voters who actually voted in recent presidential elections has been around 60%. Although actual turnout, votes as a percentage of total adult population, has been closer to 50%. As the figure shows, turnout is significantly higher in presidential elections than in midterm elections. Turnout is even lower in primaries and caucuses. In the main, turnout is higher for white than for non-whites. African Americans were an exception in 2008 and 2012 when Barack Obama was on the ballot. For older Americans than for younger Americans, and for college graduates than for people with high school education or less. Men and women, however, they say, vote at roughly the same rate. Many factors explain variation in turnout. Turnout is also affected by structural factors, such as state laws that prohibit convicted felons from voting, laws that require citizens to be registered to vote a set number of days before an election, variation in early voting, and voting by mail laws requiring a photo ID to vote, and laws that make it easier or harder to obtain an absentee ballot. However, turnout is far below 100%. Even in areas of the country where all of these factors are set to make it easy for people to vote, analysis shows that turnout is much higher among people who consider going to the polls an obligation of citizenship, feel guilty when they do not vote, or think that the election matters. Turnout is much lower among those who are angry with the government, think that government actions do not affect them, or think that voting will have no impact on government policy. These findings demonstrate the importance of mobilization in elections as discussed earlier. Many candidates for political office spend at least as much time trying to convince their supporters to vote as they do trying to persuade others to become supporters in the first place. Because many of Americans either do not vote or vote only sporadically, mobilization is vital for winning elections. How do people vote? Although candidates, parties, and other organizations release a blizzard of endorsements, reports, and press releases throughout the campaigns, much of this information may be difficult to interpret. It is a daunting task, even for the rare, highly motivated voter. Voting cues, the combination of a lack of interest and a relatively complex task, leads most Americans to base their voting decisions on easily interpretable pieces of information or voting cues. Voters in American national elections use many kinds of cues, such as party ID, voting for the candidates who shares your party ID, the personal vote, voting for candidates who has helped you get assistance from a government agency or has helped your community benefit from desirable government projects. Personal characteristics, voting for the candidates whose personal characteristics such as age, race, gender, ethnicity, religious beliefs, or background match your own. Or pocketbook voting, voting for the incumbent if the economy is strong and for the challenger otherwise. Voters can also use multiple cues. Cues give people a low effort way to cast a vote that more likely than not is consistent with the voter's true preference among candidates. Studies have found that citizens who use cues and are politically well informed are more likely to cast a reasonable vote, one that consists with their underlying policy preferences relative to candidates' positions, than those whose cues but are otherwise relatively politically ignorant. In essence, knowing something about the candidates and the issues at stake in an election helps people select the right cue on which to base their vote. All the strategies identified here for making voting decisions are used to some extent in every election. In normal elections, when congressional re-election rates are high and the seat shift between the parties is small, voters generally use cues that focus on the candidates themselves, such as an incumbency, partisanship, a personal connection to a candidate, or the candidate's personal characteristics or past performance. This behavior is consistent with the saying that all politics is local. Many congressional elections are independent, local contests in which a candidate's chances of winning depend on what voters think of the candidate in particular, not the president, Congress, or national issues. It also explains why electoral coattails are typically very weak in American elections and why so many Americans cast split tickets rather than straight tickets. In the main voting decision in presidential and congressional elections are made independently of each other. Voting in wave elections. Wave elections generally occur when a large number of voters vote against incumbents because of poor economic conditions, political scandal, or a costly unpopular war. In 2010, many Americans were concerned about the state of the economy, the size of corporate bailouts, the apparent ineffectiveness of economic stimulus legislation, and the enactment of health care reform, and they blamed the party in power, Democrats, for all of these outcomes. As a result, a significant percentage of Americans voted against Democratic congressional candidates either as a protest vote because they disapproved of their performance or as an effort to put different individuals in charge, in the hope that new members would bring out about improved conditions. In contrast, 2020 was not a wave election. While Democrats won the presidency, Republicans captured House seats and prevented Democrats from gaining majority control of the Senate. Here is a figure of 8.3 of the House incumbent. Even in wave elections, re-election rates For members of Congress, the percentage of incumbents who successfully run for re-election are generally high. As Figure 8.3 shows, for the House of Representatives over the last generation, during that period, neither party had a House re-election rate of less than 80%. Even in 2006, when 100% of Democratic House incumbents running for re-election were re-elected, the re-election rate for House Republican incumbents was almost 90%. Re-election rates for members of Congress are so high because senators and representatives work to insulate themselves from electoral challenges through tactics we discuss in this chapter, and we will discuss further in Chapter 10. Even so, congressional incumbents are not necessarily safe from electoral defeat. Rather, their high re-election rates result from the actions they take every day, which are calculated to win favor with their constituents. In normal elections, these strategies are generally enough to ensure re-election in nationalized elections. However, they are not enough to guarantee re-election for some legislators from the disadvantaged party, such as Democrats in 2010. Understanding the 2018 and 2020 elections. In recent years, every election has been described as the most important election in American history. And in truth, elections always matter because they determine who exercises power in Washington, who sets government policy. During the 2016 campaign, for example, it seemed likely that America's next president would appoint several Supreme Court justices, leading to significant policy changes on issues like abortion and affirmative action. Republican control of the presidency would make it easier to change President Obama's health care and financial reforms, as well as his executive orders. As we discussed throughout this book, the election of Donald Trump in 2016 has brought many of these outcomes to pass. At one level, the essential question in 2020 was whether voters would support the Trump Republican policy agenda of tax cuts, reductions in domestic spending, and increases in military spending, loosening of business and environmental regulations, reestablishment of tariffs, further restrictions on immigration, and selection of conservatives up to the federal judiciary. All of these issues were overshadowed by the debate over how to address the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic and its damage to America's economy and society, and who to blame for missteps in federal policy. In political terms, the 2020 elections were scrutinized to see if patterns seen in the 2018 elections would prove lasting or transitory. I'm sorry if I mispronounced that. Would Democrats retain gains in rural and suburban areas, and among Republicans disenchanted with President Trump, would the gender gap widen or narrow? Would minority turnout, which dropped in 2016 and bounced back somewhat in 2018, increase to earlier levels or grow even more, buoyed by nationwide protests demanding systematic changes in government and policing after the killing of George Floyd? How would the pandemic that still threatened the country impact voter turnout rates, especially for those groups particularly at risk for COVID-19, including the elderly, who are typically one of the most reliable voting blocs? The answers would determine which party held majorities in the House and Senate, and thereby shape the trajectory of government policy over the next 2 years. The path to 2020. The 2018 elections. The 2018 elections campaigns for all 435 seats in the House of Representatives, as well as 35 Senate elections. At first glance, electoral forces favored Republicans in 2018. With a strong economy and no major international conflicts, however, sustained partisan polarization meant that economic factors were relatively less important than in previous elections. For many Americans, vote decisions were driven by party identification and their approval or disapproval of President Trump's performance in office. The most important structural feature of 2018 was the partisan division of Senate seats of the 35 seats contested. Democrats controlled 26 and the Republicans only 9. Moreover, of the dozen or so seats that were truly in play, 10 were Democratic, many of them in strongly Republican states such as North Dakota, because Democrats had to divide campaign resources among a much larger number of seats than Republicans did. The odds favored Republican rather than Democratic gains. In contrast, Democrats had notable opportunities in House contests. Democrats needed 23 seats to regain majority control, a number smaller than the average number of seats, about 30, gained by the party out of power in midterm House elections. Moreover, an abnormally high number of Republican incumbents retired rather than pursue another term. Some left because the party's rules forced them to step down from committee chairs. Some departed to pursue other offices. Some retired because of scandals, and some left because they feared losing a primary or general election. These retirements raised Democratic hopes for gains in Republican-held suburban districts. A final fundamental factor was a Democratic advantage in enthusiasm. National polls consistently showed higher levels of interest among Democrats compared to Republicans, as well as a Democratic advantage in polls asking which party respondents would like to control Congress. The campaign. The early months of the election cycle set the tone for the entire campaign in House campaigns. Democrats fielded many well-funded, politically experienced candidates, while Republicans struggled to find good replacements for retiring incumbents or as challengers against Democrats. And while Senate Republicans reinforced their structural advantage by nominating a slate of well-qualified candidates, including several House members and governors, Democratic incumbents such as Jon Tester, Democrat of Montana, and Joe Manchin, Democrat of West Virginia, ran effective campaigns that highlighted their attention to local concerns and willingness to vote with President Trump on issues vital to their states. Democrats also outraised their Republican opponents in many races in the closing weeks of the campaign. Most national level predictions were close to expectations at the beginning of the election cycle. Democrats were likely to win a House majority, while Republicans would hold the Senate. Within the parties, however, the campaign revealed important disagreements on policy. In several Democratic primaries, liberal challengers unseated longtime incumbent House members, including Joe Crowley, Democrat of New York, who was chair of the Democratic caucus. Many other Democratic challengers refused to commit to voting for Minority Leader Nancy Pelosi as Speaker if Democrats regained the majority. On the Republican side, several incumbents, including Senators Jeff Flake, Republican of Arizona, and Bob Corker, Republican of Tennessee, retired in the face of strong conservative opposition. The election. During the final weeks of the campaign, polls revealed that many House and Senate seats were still in play, as President Trump also crisscrossed the country, holding rallies in strong Republican areas. In the end, the 2018 election met expectations. Democrats gained a House majority by capturing Republican suburban districts and capitalizing on Republican open seats. In Senate elections, Democrats captured 2 seats, Nevada and Arizona, but lost other races, allowing Republicans to retain their Senate majority. Exit polls that asked respondents about their vote in House elections showed that, for the most part, vote decisions reflected partisanship and opinions about President Trump. The 2018 results also showed a strong gender gap, with higher rates of Democratic voting among women, as well as a strong correlation of Democratic voting with race and with education. Moreover, voters in lower income brackets were much more likely to vote Democratic, while voters in higher income brackets showed similarly high rates of voting for Republicans. Interestingly, the gap between Democratic and Republican voters narrowed for those making over $100,000 per year. The 2020 elections. The nomination process when Joe Biden entered the race for the Democratic presidential nomination in the summer of 2019, many people and some political scientists argued that he would have little chance of winning. Biden was a career politician who had held elected office for 47 years, running at a time when trust in government was near all-time lows. He had run 2 disorganized, unsuccessful presidential nomination campaigns. If elected, he would be 78 years old on Inauguration Day, making him the oldest person to begin a presidency by more than 7 years. In retrospect, however, Biden was a perfect fit for the political moment. His reputation as a centrist Democrat helped secure votes from moderate voters, especially white voters in the Midwest who were not college educated, who had defected to Trump in 2016. At the same time, his willingness to listen and respond to demands from liberal Democratic groups helped unify the party. Biden also had strong support from Black voters, a key Democratic constituency, in part because of his service as Barack Obama's vice president. Biden faced strong opposition for the nomination for Senators Kamala Harris, Bernie Sanders, and Elizabeth Warren, as well as former mayor of South Bend, Indiana, Pete Buttigieg, the first openly gay candidate for a majority party presidential nomination, former New York City mayor and billionaire Michael Bloomberg, and a number of other candidates. While Biden did not do well in the early nomination contests, he scored a decisive win in the South Carolina primary in late February and won the most delegates in the Super Tuesday contest on March 3rd. By mid-March, as other candidates dropped out of the contest, Biden emerged as the clear favorite for the nomination. He spent the months until the Democratic National Convention in August 2020 building party unity. He further commented his position by choosing Kamala Harris, a daughter of Indian and Jamaican immigrants, as his vice presidential nominee. The COVID-19 pandemic also worked against President Trump's re-election chances. A strong majority of Americans believe that Trump had mismanaged the pandemic, from failing to stockpile medical supplies or order early lockdowns to discouraging mask wearing and frequently claiming that the end of the pandemic was almost in sight, only to be contradicted by increasing virus caseloads and fatalities. These perceptions were reinforced after Trump, First Lady Melania Trump, and many senior aides caught the coronavirus after a public event in September 2020, an event at which most participants did not wear masks or socially distance. The shutdown of large parts of the economy as a result of the virus led to the loss of 22 million jobs from February to April. Just over half of those jobs had been restored by Election Day, presenting an additional hurdle for Trump's re-election. While the pandemic and economic collapse did not cause a sharp decline in Trump's approval rating, they presented a strong, visible counterargument to his attempts to convince Americans that he deserved another term. President Trump did not face significant opposition in the Republican nomination process. In fact, the entire process demonstrated his control over the party. He received a unanimous endorsement from the Republican National Committee in February 2020. Several states canceled their primaries and caucuses because Trump was their only candidate, and others used winner-take-all voting to ensure that only Trump would receive conventional delegates. Finally, National Committee members decided against producing a new party platform, instead endorsing the president and the platform adopted at the 2016 convention. The 2020 general election campaign. The 2020 general election campaign played out in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic. In addition to being a major campaign issue, the pandemic transformed the campaign itself to minimize risks to campaign workers and voters. The Biden campaign did almost no door-to-door canvassing, although Democratic affiliated groups and the Trump campaign had modest operations. Joe Biden campaigned largely from the basement of his home via Zoom, holding only small socially distanced events. The Trump campaign relied on large rallies as in 2016. While the Trump campaign began the nomination campaign with a significant financial advantage, it spent much of its cushion on early ads and field offices, forcing it to curb advertising during the general election campaign. In contrast, the Biden campaign raised an unprecedented amount of funds, allowing it to dominate the airwaves during the last few months of the election. The campaign revolved around two sets of issues. The first involved the candidates themselves. Trump claimed that Biden was a moderate in name only, or that he would defer the more liberal Harris. On this point, Biden's extensive career in office gave him an effective counter, as it demonstrated his relatively moderate leanings. Trump also argued that Biden lacked the energy and the mental acuity to serve as president, calling him Sleepy Joe. Here again, Biden's campaign performance, including two national debates, effectively countered these attacks. At the same time, Trump was himself an issue. After 4 years of outrageous tweets, threats, and blustering against political opponents, and his apparent lack of interest in the details of governing, as exemplified by his perceived mismanagement of the COVID-19 pandemic, Trump's approval ratings were stuck in the low 40s. The second set of campaign issues reflected the enduring split between parties. In essence, Trump promised to continue tax cuts, limits on immigration, nominations on conservative judges, and rollbacks of government regulation. The Biden-Harris campaign promised to expand the size and scope of government, including new health care programs, more efforts to combat climate change, fewer limits on immigration, and a path to citizenship for undocumented individuals, and new efforts to limit police brutality against minority citizens. Because COVID-19 had reduced the amount of campaigning by both candidates and generated uncertainty about turnout, both sides focused on the potential for an October surprise, an event that would cause citizens to reconsider their judgments about the candidates. The Trump campaign held high hopes for the first televised debate, believing that Trump would demonstrate that Biden was not up to the job. However, Trump's constant interruptions, muttered asides, and abrupt attacks on Biden reinforced existing impressions of both candidates. Trump moderated his behavior in the second and final debate, but was unable to make a convincing attack on Biden or his record. Late in October, the New York Post ran a story about a laptop owner by Biden's son Hunter that allegedly contained compromising emails. This story collapsed after a few days when it became clear that Trump's supporters, including Trump's personal lawyer, former New York Mayor Rudy Giuliani, had been involved in bringing the story to the Post, and that there was no evidence that the laptop actually belonged to Hunter Biden. The general election. Throughout the general election, campaign polls showed Biden with a significant national lead and smaller but consistent advantages in swing states. Biden's lead widened in early October after Trump's poor performance in the first debate and his hospitalization for coronavirus, then contracted slightly as the election approached. There was also uncertainty about who would actually cast votes, as most states expanded early voting and allowed no excuse absentee mail-in voting in order to reduce the risk of holding an election during the pandemic. These concerns were magnified after President Trump repeatedly claimed during the election that mail-in voting would encourage fraud and urged his supporters to vote in person. On Election Day, many observers were surprised by the strength of Trump's support in early returns. He outperformed the polls in several swing states, including Florida and Iowa. Democrats were unsuccessful in capturing Texas, although Biden did much better than other recent Democratic nominees. However, it soon became apparent that Trump's support was overstated by early returns, as several key states had not counted the large number of mail-in ballots, which were expected to favor Biden. In the days after the election, county election boards processed the remaining ballots, giving Biden victories in Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. The blue wall of Democratic Midwestern support that Trump won in 2016, as well as victories in Nevada, Arizona, and Georgia. Turnout was almost 67%, the highest in 120 years. Biden had strong support from young voters, women, and minorities. In all, Biden received 306 electoral votes. See figure 8.4. During the few days it took To determine a clear winner in Pennsylvania, Nevada, and Georgia, President Trump issued numerous tweets and campaign press releases claiming that the extended vote count was fraudulent and that local election officials were stealing the election from him. While Trump was right in claiming that a high percentage of mail-in ballots favored Joe Biden, there was no evidence of misconduct at any level. Biden's strength in the mail-in vote reflected that the fact that Trump had discouraged his supporters from voting in this way, and that many mail-in ballots came from urban counties where many voters supported Biden. After the major networks declared Biden the winner, Trump refused to concede the election or call Biden to congratulate him, and his campaign pursued legal. I'll pause there so you can take a look at that. Challenges in some states. However, the courts did not sustain these claims as the Trump campaign had no evidence to back them up. While some Republicans, including Senators Ted Cruz and Lindsey Graham, supported Trump's attacks, others, such as Senator Mitt Romney and former President George W. Bush, congratulated Biden and called for Trump to concede. What Trump faced was reality. We have noted throughout this chapter, American elections are decided by counting votes. There is no requirement that the loser concede, accept defeat, or literally do anything. Even for candidates who happen to be president, elections are out of their hands. In congressional races, Democrats netted only one Senate seat, leaving them still short of majority control, with two outstanding runoff elections in Georgia, and in the biggest surprise of the election, they lost about 8 seats in the House. Here and in the presidential race, it is hard to read a strong policy mandate in the election results. Table 8.3 shows clear policy differences between Biden voters and Trump voters, but given Democrats' losses in the House and their failure to capture the Senate, it is unclear whether Biden can capitalize on his victory to pursue an aggressive policy agenda. Consequences in the 2020 election. Excuse me. It is easy to imagine that Joe Biden's victory will lead to significant policy changes. Biden has reassembled the Democratic coalition that elected Barack Obama twice and regained control of the House of Representatives in 2018. Biden received more than millions more votes than Hillary Clinton did in 2016. He leads a Democratic Party that unified behind his candidacy, achieving record turnout despite the COVID-19 pandemic, including large numbers of new minority voters. To be sure, Biden can accomplish a great deal using executive orders and personal action, such as rejoining the World Health Organization and the Paris Agreement on climate change, deprioritizing federal pursuit of undocumented individuals, increasing admissions of refugees, and rebuilding America's relations with other countries. But policies that require legislative action will occur only if Biden can give votes from Senate Republicans. At the same time, Senate Republicans are unlikely to agree to institutional changes that would help Biden, such as eliminating the filibuster or increasing the size of the Supreme Court. There are also deep splits among Democratic office holders over policy priorities, including hot-button issues of climate change and renewable energy, police reform, immigration, and health care. Biden also inherits the COVID-19 pandemic, and much of his first few years in office will be focused on developing and deploying an effective vaccine and on the returning of the country to something approaching normal politics. Indeed, one of his first actions as president-elect was to appoint an informal task force to review current policies and make recommendations for new initiatives. Finally, Biden leads a country that is divided as ever. Biden's clear victory in the popular vote and the Electoral College is overshadowed by his razor-thin victories, Georgia, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, and the fact that over 70 million people voted for Donald Trump. Given that Trump vigorously contested the legitimacy of Biden's win, claiming without evidence that the election was stolen from him, many of his supporters are unlikely to ever accept Biden's presidency. Achieving policy victories under these conditions is certainly not guaranteed. What we know for sure is that politics matter, so the fight to win elections and shape government policy will continue unabated. Unpacking the conflict. Considering all that we've discussed in this chapter, let's apply what we know about how elections work to the example of Sarah Gideon's loss in the 2020 Maine Senate election, introduced at the beginning of the chapter. Ultimately, how meaningful was Susan Collins' victory in Maine in 2020, or Democrats' failure to win a Senate majority? What do election results tell us about why some candidates win